Hello, and I'm so glad that you have joined me for this webinar today. Anyone who's involved or engaged in intervening in the lives of teenagers is doing a heroic job and facing great challenges. And so I'm glad that you've joined me to help improve your skills, and I hope that the information that we'll share with you today will do just that. This is a community of people. The people from all over the United States have joined in on this webinar. Social workers, foster parents, people who are involved with trying to relate to teenagers. I want to encourage you to use the chat to interact with each other as we go through this next hour. And then as we move forward, you can also post questions you might have in the Q&A, and then I'll try to manage my time so that at the end of this broadcast, we'll have an opportunity to engage with some of those questions. Through a foster care agency where I served on the board of directors in the role of program managers, I have created and managed a youth intervention program that we've been running on middle and high school campuses in Northern California for the past 3 years. My ultimate goal was to help teens in the development and adaptation of core social and emotional skills that will help them experience better success in their life now, and more importantly, as they move toward independent adulthood. Getting teens to look up from their phones and talk is all by itself a huge task. Getting them to think critically, problem solve, show empathy, resolve conflicts, understand and regulate their emotions, move past avoidance, or develop resilience is gigantic. What I discovered as we set out to solve this problem was that following a life coaching pattern in conversations with teens made a significant difference in the way they engaged in that conversation and in the way they began to participate in thinking through their own life. What I want to do with you today is share the wide-angle view of this approach to teen engagement. First, we're going to discuss the makeup of the teenage brain, and then we'll dig into the framework of coaching methodology. Then finally, we'll end up talking about adaptations you will need to make in order to effectively use these tools. When I started researching, I was looking for the causal factors of teenage risky behaviors. I wanted to understand the elements that slowed the progress of healthy social and emotional development, and then find what methods could be used to improve those deficiencies. So I read a ton of books and academic papers on the neurobiology of teenagers. The conclusion in most of those studies is that brain development over the first 21 years of life is slowly moving from the back of the human brain to the front. That means that the very last places to connect in that development are the frontal lobes. As you can see in this illustration, the development of the limbic center, which is the emotional seat of the brain, is growing faster and stronger than that of the prefrontal cortex, which is the rational seat. This gap, which you can see here labeled on this chart as the risky period for obvious reasons, explains why teenagers behave as they do with mood swings, irritability, impulsiveness, inability to focus, follow through, and particularly the inability to connect with adults who are regularly exasperated by the things teenagers do that defy reason and logic. The frontal lobes are where actions are weighed, situations judged, and decisions are made. Because this is the last place to develop in the brain, teenagers will need help in those critical areas of thought and consideration. So adults find themselves, like in this meme, screaming, why won't you let me help you? We're trying to help them to reason better. We're trying to help them to come up with logical ways of thinking. And we get exasperated, they get exasperated with us. Several times in my research, I wanted to say, yeah, I didn't need science to tell me that teens are impulsive, forgetful, hyper-emotional, and unpredictable. What science does do is it gives us an explanation for this irrational behavior. So how does this help us? First, I would say that it should help us to be more patient and understanding. Between this slow brain development and the assault of hormones they are experiencing, there's a lot of the pieces in the life of a teenager over which they have very little understanding, why they're happening, or very much control. But the second benefit from this neurobiological understanding is that it can help shape the way that we interact with teens. Think about the common experience that teenagers have with adults. Look at this next slide. I've illustrated it as teens being boxed in by one side by information. So that's primarily coming through educational sources where teachers are trying to help them to understand and to gain information. On the other side, you have the people who are both teachers, parents, perhaps probation officers or people in corrections, school counselors, foster parents, biological parents who are trying to help teens by giving them warnings, cautioning them. And then on the top side, you see that they are being asked questions, but those questions tend to be more accusatory sort of questions. Why did you do that? What were you thinking? And sometimes we even abbreviate that into, were you thinking? Judgments, demands, exasperated explanations, and accusing questions all tend to ignite that emotional center, producing feelings of worthlessness on one extreme and anger on the other. Each of those extremes have their own counterpart behaviors: isolation and withdrawal for the feelings of worthlessness, or hitting, yelling, and other expressions of rage for feelings of anger. There are ways to interact with teens that help build and reinforce that connection to their rational mind. Cheryl Feinstein, in her book, Inside the Teenage Brain, wrote this. She said, adolescents start to have the computational and decision-making skills of an adult, if given time and access to that information. But in the heat of the moment, their decision-making can be overly influenced by emotions. We all know that. We all see that. So that's, in a nutshell, what I've been trying to explain, that gap, that division between the development and the activity of their emotional mind and then the lower line of that development of their rational thinking, that gap is contributing to this kind of activity, this kind of this emotional outburst and this emotionally controlled thinking. So what she says is that that students can access the same rational capabilities of adults, but that requires time and space to access that information. If you think about it, a lot of our emotional and mental wellness is sacrificed by the absence of time, that we're not given the time to be able to really process and weigh things out, to be able to reflect. And in the life of a teenager, when everything is screaming at them at light speeds, the amount of time that they spend clicking from one thing to the next thing on their cell phones, their attention span's very, very narrow, and then the onslaught of information coming at them is just in this deluge. They are being overwhelmed with information, with cautions and warnings, and with some questions, but those questions can be accusatory. So in coaching, the best gift that we give to students is the gift of time, space, the ability to sit down and think about things in their lives from a completely different framework. So let's talk about that coaching framework. The first one is creating space. One of the greatest gifts, as I've already said, coaching offers to teenagers is the gift of time and space. So if you're a social worker, you'll need to make that shift, that change from wearing a social worker hat into a different sort of role. And so you might want to have a conversation that starts with, I want to have a different kind of conversation with you. A lot of your conversations are just check-ins, or you're trying to help them solve a problem, or there's some family difficulty that's going on, and you're trying to de-escalate situations or people in those situations. So you'll have to take a time out of those, or maybe between those crises interventions, to be able to have conversations with teenagers that are more constructive and tapping into that land in their mind that's often not visited. So that helping them connect with that rational, with that prefrontal cortex. How do we help them develop that? Well, we need to come at it from a different angle rather than informational cautions and warnings or accusatory questions. We need to come at it from an angle where we can stimulate that part of their minds. So we've recently been calling these open world conversations. So you might say to a teen, I want to have an open world conversation to you. And they'll look at you strange. The reason we're using that is because that's language that teens understand from video games. And so there's some video games that as you play them, they're linear. So you have to follow a particular path in order to get to the end of the mission or to the objective. But there's other games that are designed as open world concepts. So then the player can go anywhere they want to go. There's no restrictions, well, outside of just the landscape of the game. But they're not required to go right or left or straight at particular places. They can explore. So we want to use that same kind of idea when we're relating to teens and inviting them into a new type of conversation. I want to have an open world conversation with you. That means that wherever you want to go in this conversation, I'm going to go with you. If whatever you want to talk about, whatever's on your mind. And that's really the power of coaching as a practice, is that it puts the control in the hand of the person who's being coached. So they have things in their mind, they have problems they want to solve, they have goals they want to move toward. And often we find ourselves in situations where we're trying to impose things on them that are important to us. The next coaching framework is asking questions no one else is asking them and that they are not considering themselves. Coaching questions sit in this dark, unfrequented space of a teenager's brain. So we get to ask questions that other people are not asking them. Other people are asking them for information. Their geography teacher at school is wanting to know, do you know, they're asking them questions about geography. Do you know what the capital city is for the state of Florida? So they're getting questions that are predictable to information that they're receiving in an educational setting. Sometimes foster parents or biological parents are asking those questions of teens, like they want to know what's going on in their life or where they were today, what they did on that particular day. So we want to position ourselves, if we're going to be effective at engaging these teens, we want to position ourselves in a place where we're asking the kinds of questions that other people are not asking them, and some of the questions that they're not even entertaining themselves. So we'll get to a list of questions. In fact, we sent you out a list ahead of time of 25 coaching questions, and we'll revisit some of those things in just a bit, or talk about the nature of those questions and what they do. So there's another thing that's connected to neurobiology as it relates to asking questions, is that neurologists say that the brain clicks in when it's asked a question, when a person's asked a question, their brain clicks into what's called instinctive elaboration. That's where the brain wants to solve the puzzle, wants to answer that question. Some of you have had that situation where you were with your friend or you're with your spouse or your partner, and you were trying to remember a person's name, and it just couldn't come to you. And I've been guilty of waking up at 2 o'clock in the morning with that person's name snapped into my head. Why? Because my brain didn't stop acting on that question. That instinctive elaboration kicked in. We really want to utilize that in the lives of teens. There's some questions that you're going to ask them that are so important, and they're going to trigger that inside of their mind to the place to where that's going to stay with them long after that conversation. You might be 2 or 3 weeks down the road of having conversations with them, and the answer to that question is going to surface. The brain wants to solve those problems. That happens in the life of adults, that happens in the lives of teens. Coaching questions promote, look at this list, self and situational awareness. So we want to help the teen to explore where they are and their situations around them, to see themselves. The exploration of intention and options. So we don't question motives, and I would discourage you from asking questions that start with the word why, because why tends to sound judgmental. It tends to sound like you're questioning their motivations. But you do want to get at intentions. What did you intend to do? What did you expect to happen here? Those kinds of questions will help to explore intention. And then options. Okay, so what can you do? They're so used to, teenagers in particular, are so used to having people fill in the blanks for them. How many times have you asked somebody a question and they reply, or especially a teenager, and they reply with, I don't know. And so if you hear that too often, in too many settings, you'll start to believe the narrative. They don't know. Their brains are empty. And it's my job now, okay, so I believe you. I've asked you 17 times about this thing, and every time you've answered me the question, I don't know. So now I believe you. I don't think you know, and so let me help you know. And we go into advising, we go into instructing, we go into cautioning mode. And at that point, we suspend those conversations. We interrupt those conversations because we're no longer letting the teen work those things out for themselves. So exploration of intention and options. The next one is insight to understand personal strengths and values. So a lot of times teens have a very unrealistic view of themselves or circumstances around them. So we want to tether them back into, okay, so what are your strengths? What are you bringing into this problem that will help you? And on the other side of that, what are the things you're missing? So understand their insight, their personal strengths, and their values. What matters to you? Coaching questions also help in the identification of restrictions to forward movement. What's really standing in your way? What's the greatest challenge you're faced with here? You want to help the teen explore those things with good coaching questions. The next one is connecting cause and effect change. Some of you are so frustrated because you've seen teenagers in your care or that are on your caseload that have over and over again made the same mistakes over and over again. And it's exasperating. It's so frustrating to see that teen making those things. It's like, are you not connecting the pieces here? You did this and this was the result. And now you're doing this again and you're getting the same result. Shouldn't you try changing something else? Well, coaching can help them connect those cause and effect chains, but it's not going to happen through a direct instructional approach. See this plus this equals this. That kind of rational thinking by instruction or caution is going to trigger rebellion in a teenager rather than inquisition or a curiosity. So connecting cause and effect chains. The next one is building empathy. So a lot of these kids have an incredible capacity to empathize with other people who are suffering, especially if they've suffered traumas and abuses in their life. They have an incredibly deep well of empathy, but that keeps getting undermined or overwhelmed, probably is a better way to say that keeps getting overwhelmed by their own emotional needs or their self-centeredness. We are growing into more and more of a very narcissistic, self-centered society, and teenagers are not the only ones experiencing this. Adults are giving over huge territory of their life to just pay attention to themselves rather than paying attention to the needs of others. So coaching gives you the ability to ask a question that is going to help that teen engage that empathy. So that's a strong emotion, but it's tethered to something that's outside of themselves. The last two are creating action steps. We'll talk about a little bit more about that in a bit. That's coaching questions will help them design action steps that they can take. And then the last one is ownership. And this is the thing that I think propelled me forward in coaching. When I first got into coach training, I really didn't like it. I had been in a profession where I gave advice to people liberally and readily. And I liked that role. I liked people coming and saying, hey, what would you do about this? And I'd tell them what they should do about it. So I was the advice giver. I was the advice dispensary in a lot of people's lives. And I had to sit back at some point as I started into this coach training. I had to sit back and think, okay, so what came of all of that? What benefits did people actually receive from having me tell them what they ought to do? And the result was pretty abysmal. It wasn't great. They did not act on most of the advice that I gave them. And some of it was really, really good, but it wasn't theirs. Ownership when it comes to problem solving, settling down and figuring out a path forward toward your goal or through problems, ownership of that choice is the highest predictor of whether that person's actually going to follow through and do what they said that they're going to do. So coaching questions promote that. I just pulled 6 questions out of the list that I sent you through that PDF. There's 25 questions on there. They're all really good questions. But I just want to point out, just rehearse these 6 real quickly to point at the nature of questions, what they do. The first one is question number 4. What does your intuition tell you about this? So that's a question you can ask a teen as they're wrestling with a decision, or as they're talking about a relationship with someone, or they're comparing one choice or another. Asking them what their intuition tells them about this is a really great question, because now you're exploring territory, again, that nobody's asking them about or that they're not considering. Adults typically will say, okay, what's the best choice? Well, they can make that choice, but that's very, very rational. When you ask the question, what does your intuition tell you about this? You're tapping into something that's much deeper in them and probably an area that they've not considered before. Question number 11 is what's called the AWE question. If you've done any reading and coaching, you probably ran across this. The AWE stands for and what else? And what I found in coaching is that as you're talking to a teenager and you're helping them to process things, the questions often, if you're getting them engaged and they're starting to be chatty and starting to engage with that conversation, you'll ask them a question and you'll get a surface level response. Just the thing right off the top of their head. And that's fine. I don't judge that. I don't say, oh, well, that's, evaluate that in any way. I'll ask the question, okay, and so what else? And so then they'll struggle to come up with another question. And I've asked that question, the and what else question, 6 or 7 times on one primary question, to the point to where the teenagers look at me like, what do you want from me? Well, I want the thing where a light goes on. I want the answer where something shifts. I can see it in their face. I can see it in the way that they're relating and the stuff that or the affect. I can see when a question has landed in a way, or that their answer is prompting something that it just lands differently. So that's what I'm after. I'm after that kind of experience. And so you might have to ask that and what else question until you really get to that deeper level of connection and understanding. Question number 14 is, so you said you can't do blank, so you're talking with them about options and a way to move forward. And so your follow-up question might be, so you said you can't do blank, is there something between here and there that you can do now? What I found, and the coaching program I mentioned earlier that we developed on middle school and high school campuses going on right now across Northern California, in these schools we have coaching groups. And what the students say, and most of these groups are populated by at-risk students. They're populated by foster care kids, by kids that are determined to be homeless, extreme low-income families. So we're dealing with kids that are not the middle of the road. These are marginalized students, but the thing that those students tell us as they go through these 12 weeks of being coached in these groups is, number one, they build community with other people. It's good for them to understand that other people go through the same kinds of things that they're going through. But the other thing that they consistently report to us after these groups, the thing that they consistently say to us is, I was helped by breaking down a bigger thing into a smaller thing. And you've had that experience going out and deciding on a Saturday that you're going to clean out your garage, and you open up the garage door and you're standing there with your coffee cup and you're looking at the chaos. You're looking at the overwhelming size of the project. And it's like, where do I even start? Well, teenagers are facing those kinds of things all the time. Problems in their lives, goals they want to move toward, and it just seems insurmountable. So that question says, you can't do this. You can't go all the way here. Is there something between here and there that you could do right now? So that helps with that immediacy of making an action step that will move them a little bit closer, but it's doable. It's something that's attainable to them today. Question number 19 says, what are you willing to do to improve this situation? So that puts the responsibility on them, and that's what we're asking for them to do. We're treating them as pre-adults. What are you willing to do to improve this situation? You want improvement, what are you willing to do? And a lot of times teenagers will point at every other circumstantial or individual around them and say, well, if they do this, then my life would be better. This would get better if they would change the situation. And so you have to bring them back to, okay, well, we're not talking to them right now. I'm talking to you. So what are you willing to do to improve the situation? Bring that back to themselves. What's under your control? What can you do to move forward? Question 21 is, who do you need to become in order to succeed here? Again, we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but those being questions. Who will you need to become in order to succeed in this? So a lot of times teens have this fantasized view of, I just want to get here. And unfortunately, because of social media, because they see these people who were nobodies 3 days ago, and then they post something that goes viral, and suddenly they have a following of 100,000 people or whatever it is. It can appear that success is instantaneous, that I can snap my fingers, or that I can just be in the right place doing the right thing, and then I'm going to be what I want to be. You have to reel that back in, but again, not by instruction, but by questions. Who do you need to become in order to succeed in this? Because you're going to have to make some changes. You're going to have to make some shifts. But if you say that to them directly, then you're taking the power out of their hands. And then the last question here is that I wanted to highlight out of these 25 is number 23. It says, which one of your choices would help you the most in the soonest amount of time? When we are training coaches in our program, we talk about the understanding human nature concerning change. And one of the things that we have to tap into is that there's like an emotional side of us. Some of you have heard it described as the elephant and the rider. The rider is the intellect, the logic, the rational side of us. The elephant is the emotional side of us. Well, teenagers, because that emotion, that elephant is so huge in their life, and it's kind of running things, that rational understandings are not having much say. It's that rider's up there just kind of bouncing around, going for a ride on this emotion. So this question helps to feed the energy of the elephant, because I'm asking for what choices would help you the most in the soonest amount of time. I want that teen to be able to experience wins, but also to engage that energy of the elephant, of their emotions, to help propel them toward better choices. So there's just a good sampling of those questions, give you an idea of the nature of how questions work. This next coaching framework is just seeing, being, and acting. Here's the framework that we use with students is we want to help teens see, to help teens explore the landscape of their own situations and relationships. And it's like just taking an exploration on a map. And it's like, okay, I've seen this territory, I understand what this is, but now I want to move into places. I want to see what else is involved here. And your curiosity around that as a coach will help that student to explore things that they're not doing on their own. So we usually prepare for conversations by getting clear on what we want to say or address. So this is important to me. I'm thinking about having a meeting with somebody or sitting down with this student or this teenager, and I'm preparing by identifying all the things I want to get across to them. And coaching shifts that orientation so it has me thinking through questions like, what must this be like for them? Or what will be the most difficult thing for her to talk about? Or what is he experiencing? Now, those questions then help you to prepare to go into that without an agenda, which is a huge gift. Because if you go into a conversation with a teenager with your agenda and you're going to try to lead them to your agenda, and for them to embrace your agenda, you're going to be sitting there for a very, very long time in great frustration. So asking those questions, preparing for that conversation by saying, okay, so what's their experience like? What must they be feeling right now? Going at it with that standpoint or that perspective, and then not assuming the answers. You can kind of speculate, but don't go too far down that road because you want to stay curious. Part of the value of coaching is that we follow the students. I just wrote an article for foster parenting today. One of the examples of talking about coaching teens, one of the examples I used was a student who says, the foster parent says, how was your day at school? It was terrible. Well, if you ask, why was it terrible? Then they're going to tell you about the circumstances around that terrible day. But if you respond, and the question I suggested asking in that article was, what kind of terrible was it? Now you're helping them to explore something that they're not looking at. So the teen's going to look back at you like, what do you mean, what kind of terrible? It's just terrible. No, was it terrible sad? Was it terrible disappointing? Was it terrible lonely? We want to help teens with the language that they're using so that they understand that language. They know what it means to them, and that you're understanding what it means as well. So stay curious. The next part of that seeing, being, and acting is being, and we talked about that a little bit earlier, but this is helping teens understand the person they are or who they will need to become in their situations and relationships. Those being questions are so important. Look at this image. You've seen the iceberg image used multiple times to describe different things in our lives, but this really helped me to understand what was going on in the life of a teenager, because that small portion up top, what we see on the surface, is their doing and their behaviors. So we're constantly interacting with teenagers around what they're doing or how they're behaving. Stop that. Don't do that anymore. I need you to do this. I need this to happen. So we're constantly adjusting and working with them on the doing and the behavior side. But it's underneath, everything underneath the surface in who they are, who they're being, is what's contributing to that behavior. So if all you're doing is interacting around the surface level stuff, the behaviors, the doing, and not asking questions that are penetrating below the surface, what's their worldview? How do they look at life? What's their perspectives, their outlook? What are their assumptions about life, about circumstances, about themselves? What are their beliefs? What are their values? Yes, teenagers have values, right? They're going to be different than yours. They're not going to align with yours, but they have their own values. If you want to have a chance at changing behavior, you're going to have to tap into those values, beliefs, assumptions, and worldviews that are below the surface. All of that has to do with the world of their being. So you'll notice in the questions I sent you, a lot of those questions center on that part of their lives of who are you? What's important to you? As well as helping them fix things, I want to help them to understand themselves better. The last part of the coaching framework is acting. So seeing, being, and acting. Acting helps teens design doable steps that will create positive movement and affirming experiences. So we talked about that with the elephant and the rider. The elephant needs rewards. Teenagers need rewards. When we design actions out of a coaching relationship with teenagers, we never talk about those goals, those action steps in terms of even 2 or 3 weeks, much less 3 or 4 months. We have them design actions. What can you do in the next 3 days? What action could you take in the next 5 days to be able to move this forward? So I want that teen to experience wins sooner rather than later. And I want them to feel competent and capable of taking the steps. So if there's too many steps, if it's too far out there, if it's too far away in time, if it's too big, they won't do it. So small, measurable, doable steps. Benefits of coaching for at-risk youth is teens get empowered for their own life. This has been a big subject matter, and especially for teens in foster care, they don't feel like they have any control of their lives, and a lot of their rage, a lot of their rebellion is against those constraints that are choosing for them about their lives rather than them being able to choose for themselves. So coaching really advances that work of empowerment for the youth, can start to see themselves as agents in their own destiny or making choices for themselves. Next one is scaling goals or problems to smaller doable steps. We've talked about that a couple of times. That's huge for foster youth or at-risk teens. Non-judgmental support from a mentor coach. We train the coaches. You got to train your affect. You got to control your affect. If the teenager's going to throw something at you that you don't agree with or that violates your value system, and you have to just sit there and work with them in what they've given you. So non-judgmental support from a mentor coach. The fourth one here is true feelings of partnership and problem solving. So they have somebody who's helping them solve the problems that they're interested in, not in what the adult says you need to solve this problem. It's no, what problem do you want to solve? And then the last one is they're entrusted with the capacity to think and choose well. I heard somebody make the statement not long ago to a teenager where they said, could you even for 1 minute think about how insane that decision was? Think about all of the accusation, all of the judgment that is in that question. It's a question, to be sure, but it is questioning that teen's intelligence at one or two different levels. And in coaching, we really are entrusting that teen and believing in them and saying, you have the capacity to think and to choose well for your life. And I want to help you with that. I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I'm going to help you arrive at those conclusions on your own. So let's finish up here talking about the coaching perspective. So number one is keep the teaching and advising in check. So when you want to go into teacher mode or into advisor mode, you know, the thing that we believe about, the reason we don't like unsolicited advice is because it's unsolicited. So you want to wait for the teen to ask questions, and then you can speak into those things. But it's not until they open that door for you. So keep the teaching and advising in check. Stay present. Listen carefully. Set aside your agenda and refuse to lead them where you think they ought to go. And then the last thing, as far as you as a coach developing a coaching perspective, is trust in the coaching process to bring that teen to places of self-discovery. Be patient with this youth that is struggling toward adulthood. They are struggling. They are caught in this tidal wave of hormones. They are caught in this gap between the activity of their emotional mind and the slower, gradual development of their rational thinking, their logical mind. They're caught in those places. So be patient with them. They are struggling toward adulthood, and you have the ability to give some great help to assist them on that journey. So anyway, there's some contact information. We'll put this back up at the end, but we can jump into some questions. I don't know how much time we have left here. We have about 18, 20 minutes. So hopefully you've had some questions. I'll do my best to answer those as they come up. So again, I'm really grateful that you have spent this time, and I'm grateful for you for what you do in the lives of teenagers. So Michael asked this question: will this framework assist with building initial rapport, for example, when a teen is first placed into a foster home? And I would say yes, yes, and yes. So it gives you the opportunity to shift you're kind of disrupting the student, because they're expecting the adult to fit into that illustration we talked about earlier. Informing, cautioning, warning, or asking questions that are not really good questions. And so this gives you the chance to disrupt that, especially with a brand new placement coming in, that student coming into a new environment, a new agency, or a new home. It gives you the chance to disrupt that and become that mentor, coach, and establish that relationship right off the start. All right, and Sunny asks, what would you do with a teen who is completely apathetic, doesn't seem to care about anything? It's so sad to see that, and you see the kids that have really withdrawn. And when we talked about that scale before, that neurobiological chart, that represented from 0 to 21 years of age on the mean, on the average. But we know that children who have experienced trauma in their life, that emotional development will be slowed down and regressed, and then their rational development, their logical development is going to be on a very slow curve as well. So 21, that may be 25, 26 before those two lines converge into a place to where the rational mind, the emotional mind are working in good synchronization together. So, so I think with that person that you, or with that teenager, you're going to have to spend some time really instilling confidence in them, asking them questions that are helping them to discover who they are, what value they have, because a lot of these kids have just kind of given up on themselves. They've given up on adults. So and we have a component. I work with a lot of therapists. We've trained a lot of therapists in coaching methodology, and so one of the therapists I work with developed a trauma-informed coaching, and so maybe we'll do another webinar down the road. We'll bring in that therapist to talk about how you ask coaching questions for kids that have been severely traumatized. So we're not doing therapy in these interactions with these teens, but we are helping them to frame the way that they look at life. And so for a student like that, you may want to explore, how do I, in sensitivity to traumas that they face, how do I help them to bring up their sense of well-being, of who they are, and what the possibility is for their future, so they'll engage with that. All right, and Kathy asks, can you teach someone how to be empathetic? It seems like you either have the empathy gene or you don't. I believe that too, Kathy. I think that it is certainly easier for some people than it is for others, but you can train people. In fact, we have a coaching tool that we use with teenagers that's called the empathy tool. And it's basically where I sit down across from a teen and they're being really judgmental toward their foster parents, drawing conclusions about them, assumptions that are just really, really judgmental and blamey. And so I'll sit down with that teen and I'll start asking, okay, I'm going to change the nature of our discussion for a few minutes. And instead of asking you questions about you, I'm going to ask you some questions about me. So I'll ask the question, I'll sit there and say, okay, so what do you think is my greatest fear? And they'll say, I don't know what your greatest fear is. Okay, what would you imagine it is? And I'll go through a list of questions that have to do with hope, dreams that I have, what would be my greatest disappointment, blah, blah, blah. So just maybe 5 or 6 questions that all are about getting them to try to read me. And it's kind of uncanny sometimes how discerning and insightful these kids are when you ask them to just imagine that. You'll have to prompt them over and over again. Just imagine. What would it be? What do you think would be the thing that would make me the most sad? And so then when you get to the end of that exercise, you can say, okay, so now let's apply those same kinds of questions about your foster mom. What do you think is the most, the thing that would make her the most sad? What do you think her dreams are? And so it's amazing how you can see these kids who are really self-focused, blamey, everything's going out from them. It's like this problem, this person is the problem in my life. And you can use a tool like that because you're disarming them about you. You're a neutral person in this equation. And now they've practiced what it would be to imagine how that other person feels, what they're experiencing. And then you apply that to the person they're blaming. And it can really be helpful. So those kinds of tools can be helpful with people, as I said, and as you said, Kathy, some people just don't, they don't empathize that well. But it can be learned and developed by using some good tools. All right, Andy asked, how long should a talk last? 10 minutes or less? 10 minutes or less? Question mark. Especially when they aren't opening up, as I imagine they will. The first few times I try this, don't want to really tick them off. Yeah, great question. So yeah, if you're hitting a stone wall, then just let the questions you've asked them be. Move away from it. Great thing about you in the role of social workers is that you have ongoing times to be able to interact with these students, and so just trust that process. I've not judged them. I've not pushed my agenda on them. I've not tried to lead them to any conclusions. I've just shown an interest in them. I've been curious about them. So do that. I'd say maybe 10 minutes would be the limit with somebody who's just completely unresponsive. And then come back at it later, same methodology. All right? Carrie asks, we have volunteer mentors. This would be a great training for them. Can we get a copy of the recording? You will all receive a copy of the recording. So that will be sent out to you through your email. This Zoom recording, including the Q&A, will be sent out to you by the end of the day today or tomorrow. All right? And then Carrie asked, can you talk a little bit about the framework itself? You mentioned this is currently being used with middle school and high school youth in Northern California. Yeah, we started this, so we've kind of evolved this because of our work was, this is developed from a foster care agency in Northern California. So because of our work with social workers and wanting to help equip them, I've trained most all of our social workers, our therapist, our support specialist, anybody who's engaged with teenagers, I've trained them on coaching methods so that they can grow in their skills. But this really started from the needs in middle schools and high school campuses where administrators were saying, we need help. I talked to an administrator in far Northern California. When I told him about what we were doing, he says, 10 years ago, the only questions we were asked to answer from the state of California or the federal government pertain to academics and attendance. But he says, now we're getting questions every single week that are asking what are we doing to advance or to contribute to the development of the social and emotional learning or emotional development of students on your campus. So schools are really desperate for some solutions, so we created a group model. So we go on to campuses with 2 mentor coaches, and they're DOJ cleared, and they come onto the campus. The school selects the students, groups of up to 12. We have some schools that want to group to 15 students. It's a little much, but then we just take them through a group process where the kids are individually coached, and then they have some time for peer advising. And so we've had some really great successes in these groups, moving these students, again, as I said earlier, mostly at-risk kids that are being populated in these groups by the schools. And we've seen some really good progress with their growth and development in their social emotional development because of being in this community of other students, but also because they're being directly coached. All right. Kayla asked, what do you do with teens who continue to lie even when you've caught them red-handed and can show that they did something wrong? They continue with the denial. I would encourage you to look through those questions, and then there's an abundance of questions. If you just look for coaching questions, I found a list the other day, it was 199 coaching questions. And so there's tons of resources out there. I would encourage you to look through that list. Think about the angle of the question. So we didn't have time to discuss this, and maybe we'll do this in a future webinar or something, but there is the understanding of the angle. How is that question going to address a particular thing in the student's life? So I'm following them. So they say, I want to talk about, and we had this experience with a school up in just north of here on a high school campus, and this kid in one of these groups didn't want to talk about anything but his dog. And so the coaches were kind of exasperated because he wouldn't talk about himself. He would talk about his dog. And I said, well, talk to him about his dog, coach him about his dog and how he cares for that dog, and making sure the animal's fed correctly and all these kinds of things. That's what all the student was offering. So you followed the student in that. And they really saw some progress made with this young man because that was the only thing in his life that in his trauma-filled life that he felt a sense of ownership in or control, something he could care for that was outside of the rest of the chaos in his life. So that's what he wanted to talk about, and that coaching him about helping that animal helped him to explore some things in himself. So you want to find that angle with that, especially that student who's a liar. And a lot of these kids have learned that's their self-defense mechanism. That's the way that they navigate through life. I am going to lie until I believe it, and a lot of them do. So, so I would take a look through questions, look beyond the questions that I've sent you, look at other resources, at questions that will help you to get through, remember that iceberg thing. So there's something that's contributing to that surface level behavior of lying. Something in her worldview, in her assumptions, in that student's beliefs or values. There's something in there that is contributing to that behavior. So I'm not going to pay much attention to the behavior. I'm going to pay attention to what's below the surface. So explore those questions, think about them in relationship to your specific question about a student who's just a habitual liar. What kinds of questions would help you to be able to explore that below the surface? All right. Artisha asked, how can you connect better with a youth who is completely social phobic and does not want to talk or to be around others? Yeah, slow, patient. So I think that's going to be your best approach to this. Trust the process that these kids are going to need to be establishing relationship with adults that is characteristically different than any other adult relationship they have. And I think that's one of the privileges that we have as coaches, is that we get to model behavior that they've not experienced in education. And I'm not dissing on teachers or counselors or whatever. I'm just saying that we have a unique opportunity to model behavior that is affirming and believing in them and trusting them. So, so I would just encourage you to take the patient route, be patient in the process, keep going back to that student, asking questions, okay, so what would make you safe in this conversation, or what kinds of things would help? So help them solve their own problems in not wanting to engage with other people. I think we have time for one more, and so Dee asked, how do you encourage a teen about school and the importance of an education during this pandemic and virtual learning? I think that this pandemic has created a lot of opportunities to have conversations about values and about what's meaningful about that school experience. So again, it's just asking really, we call them, in coaching, we call them powerful questions. They're not powerful because it's like, why do you do this, right? They're powerful because they get below the surface of things. So, again, paying attention to worldview, assumptions, beliefs, that part of the teen's life where, you know, some kids have really adapted. They like, as another person asked the question about, teens are really withdrawn, and I know a lot of people. I'm a card-carrying introvert, and so there's some parts of virtual experiences and what this pandemic has done that has really been helpful to introverts, because we don't like a lot of social interaction, but for other kids it's been very disruptive. So find out how your student is wired. We offer, and there's a lot of personality types that are geared for kids, and if you email me, I can get you a copy of what we use. There's 9 different types in there, and it helps students to identify who they are, what their strengths are in a couple different categories. So whether they're creative, artistic, or there's more servers, or trying to help other people solve their problems. And it's really helpful to help kids. It's a good tool to help kids locate themselves, and then you can use that as a stepping off point to talk about their experience with other people, or their experiences with their situation, their school situations, for example. So, all right, well, we are fresh out of time. I've enjoyed, I love personal, even though I'm an introvert, I love the feedback of being able to present live. So I'm trusting that you've been nodding your heads and not sleeping as we've gone through this last hour. Hopefully it's been beneficial to you. Contact me. We have elevateusolutions.com, tells you more about the program, training opportunities. We want to help wherever we can with engaging teenagers and help them grow in those core life skills. And you have my personal email there, and then I've got blogs on social emotional intelligence, interpersonal relationships that are on my personal website, jcurtiswitt.com. So check that out, reach out, and I wish you well in engaging with students and serving their needs to help them grow into healthy, productive, well adults. Bye-bye.